He thought he was about to expose an insult. Instead, he was about to discover a truth that would leave an entire room speechless. Damien Vaughn turned around in anger so quickly that the crystal glass in his hand nearly slipped from his fingers. The private dining room on the 42nd floor of the Han River Club had gone unnaturally quiet. Just seconds earlier, laughter and polite conversation had filled the space beneath the warm glow of imported Italian chandeliers. Now every guest sat frozen. The scent of expensive wine lingered in the air. Silver utensils rested untouched beside perfectly plated meals. And at the center of it all stood a gray-haired man from Seoul whose expression had hardened into disappointment. Damien's jaw tightened. For the past 30 minutes, the evening had been unraveling one misunderstanding at a time. What was supposed to be the most important business dinner of the year had somehow transformed into a tense exchange filled with awkward pauses and visible frustration. The elderly guest, Professor Min Jae-hyun, was a respected figure whose influence stretched far beyond universities and boardrooms. Damien knew that securing his trust could open doors worth millions. Losing it could close them forever. Yet every answer coming through the hired interpreter seemed to make things worse. The professor's calm remarks arrived sounding sharp. His compliments somehow felt like criticism. His observations landed like personal attacks. Damien had spent years building an empire through discipline and control, but even he could feel his patience slipping away. Around the room, executives exchanged nervous glances. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to be the reason the deal collapsed. Near the back wall, carrying a tray of untouched coffee cups, stood Avery Brooks. Most people hadn't noticed her all evening. That was normal. Waitresses weren't supposed to attract attention in rooms like this. They moved quietly between tables, filled glasses, cleared plates, and disappeared into the background. Avery had mastered that invisibility long ago. Her black uniform blended into the shadows. Her posture remained professional. Her eyes stayed lowered whenever guests looked her way. To everyone else, she was simply another employee working a late shift. But while the executives argued through translators and assistants, Avery had been listening. Every word, every sentence, every subtle shift in tone. Her heart had started pounding 10 minutes earlier when she realized what was happening. The interpreter wasn't translating incorrectly on purpose. He was simply missing the meaning behind the words. And in Korean, meaning was everything. Damien took a step forward. The muscles in his shoulders stiffened beneath his tailored black suit. Across the table, Professor Min slowly pushed back his chair. The sound echoed through the room like a warning. A few guests glanced toward the exits. Others stared down at their plates. The atmosphere felt heavy enough to break. Then it happened. Before anyone could speak again, before another mistake could make the situation worse, Avery set down her tray. The soft sound barely registered. Yet somehow every eye turned toward her. She swallowed once. Her hands trembled slightly. Then, in flawless Korean, she spoke 6 quiet words. "Sir, you're misunderstanding what he meant." The room went silent. Completely silent. Damien froze mid-step. The interpreter's face drained of color. And Professor Min slowly lifted his eyes toward the young black waitress standing beside the wall. For the first time all night, the old professor smiled. Avery Brooks had spent most of her life learning how to disappear. As the silence settled over the private dining room, she immediately wished she could vanish again. The attention felt heavier than the marble walls surrounding her. Every executive, every assistant, every server in the room was staring. Just moments ago, she had been invisible. Now she stood at the center of the most important dinner of the year. Professor Min's smile lingered as he looked at her, but Avery kept her eyes lowered. She was not accustomed to being noticed. In fact, being unnoticed had become a survival skill. 3 years earlier, she had arrived in New York with 2 suitcases, a stack of unpaid bills, and a future that had fallen apart faster than she could understand. Since then, she had worked wherever she could. Diners, hotels, catering companies, private events, places where people remembered orders but rarely remembered faces. The Han River Club was no different. Wealthy guests filled the building every night. Politicians, executives, celebrities, and investors passed through the revolving doors beneath sparkling lights and polished brass. Avery served them all with the same quiet professionalism. Most never looked directly at her. Some snapped their fingers when they needed water. Others spoke about her, as if she could not hear them standing 3 feet away. She learned to smile. She learned to nod. She learned to move through rooms without leaving a trace. What nobody knew was that every shift felt strangely familiar. Korean conversations drifted through the dining rooms almost every evening. Business negotiations, family celebrations, corporate dinners. The language wrapped around her like distant music from another life. Sometimes she caught herself understanding every word before quickly reminding herself to focus on work. The less people knew, the safer she felt. That had always been her rule. Across the room, Damien Vaughn continued studying her. Something about that made Avery uncomfortable. Powerful men usually looked through people like her, not at them. Yet his expression held neither annoyance nor disbelief. It held curiosity, the kind that could become dangerous. Avery understood that curiosity led to questions, and questions often uncovered things she preferred to leave buried. The head server near the doorway looked equally stunned. He had worked beside Avery for nearly 18 months. They had shared countless shifts, exchanged polite greetings, and closed the restaurant together dozens of times. Yet he looked at her now as though he had never met her before. In many ways, he had not. None of them had. Because Avery Brooks had carefully constructed a life built on omissions. She never talked about college, never discussed her childhood, never mentioned the years she spent overseas. When coworkers exchanged stories during breaks, she listened more than she spoke. It was easier that way, simpler, safer. Meanwhile, Professor Min slowly folded his hands and addressed the room in Korean once more. This time Avery understood every word immediately. The interpreter did not. His hesitation returned. His uncertainty filled the room like smoke. Avery felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The room was beginning to realize that the least important person in attendance might be the only one who truly understood what was being said. And for Avery Brooks, that realization felt far more frightening than being ignored ever had. The interpreter cleared his throat and attempted to continue, but the confidence that had carried him through the evening was gone. His voice sounded thinner now, uncertain. Across the polished table, Professor Min listened patiently, then spoke another sentence in Korean. The interpreter hesitated for nearly 3 seconds before responding in English. Those 3 seconds felt enormous. Everyone noticed them. Everyone except Avery wished they had not. She knew exactly why he was struggling. Korean was not simply a language of words. It was a language of relationships, respect, and context. One misplaced expression could transform gratitude into criticism. One incorrect honorific could make a respected elder sound dismissive. And tonight, those mistakes had been stacking on top of each other for nearly an hour. Damien slowly returned to his seat without taking his eyes off Avery. The room remained tense, but the anger that had filled it earlier was being replaced by something else. Confusion, curiosity, caution. The executives seated around the table exchanged quiet glances. Nobody understood how a waitress had suddenly become central to a conversation involving some of the most influential people in the room. Avery wished she could step backward into the shadows again. Instead, Professor Min looked directly at her and spoke several sentences in Korean, his tone warm and measured. Avery froze. The request was polite, but impossible to ignore. Every eye immediately shifted toward her. The interpreter lowered his gaze. Damien leaned slightly forward. The chandeliers above reflected softly against the crystal glasses lining the table. Avery could feel her pulse in her fingertips. For a brief moment, she considered pretending not to understand. She had spent years protecting her anonymity. One more lie would be easy, but the professor was still waiting. So Avery carefully translated his words into English. The room became silent once more. This time, however, the silence felt different. Professor Min had not been criticizing Damien all evening. He had been praising him. The elderly scholar had been expressing admiration for the company's growth, respect for its charitable foundation, and appreciation for the invitation. Every statement that had sounded harsh through the interpreter had originally been generous. Several executives visibly shifted in their seats. One woman slowly removed her glasses and stared at Avery as though seeing her for the first time. Damien's expression hardened, though not toward Avery. He turned toward the interpreter. The man immediately looked away. Nobody needed an explanation. The damage was already obvious. Yet the biggest surprise came from Professor Min himself. The elderly scholar smiled and addressed Avery again in Korean. This time his eyes narrowed slightly, as though studying a memory. He asked where she had learned to speak. Avery answered carefully, Seoul, many years ago. The professor's smile disappeared, not from displeasure, but from astonishment. He stared at her for several long seconds. Then he slowly stood from his chair. Several guests rose automatically out of respect. Avery felt her stomach tighten. The old professor stepped closer, searching her face with growing disbelief. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of shock and certainty. Wait, he said softly in Korean. I know you from somewhere. The question seemed to pull all the air from the room. Avery felt dozens of eyes settle on her at once. She gripped the edge of the serving tray to keep her hands steady. Professor Min continued studying her face with growing certainty, as though searching through years of memories that refused to stay buried. The elegant dining room, filled moments ago with business discussions and expensive promises, now felt strangely small. Even the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed distant. Avery forced a polite smile. I think you may be mistaken, sir, she answered in Korean. Her voice remained calm, but her heart was racing. The professor slowly shook his head. No, he replied. I rarely forget a student. The word student landed like a stone in still water. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Damien noticed every reaction. His attention never left Avery. The waitress who had been carrying coffee cups less than 15 minutes earlier was suddenly being spoken to like a former colleague by one of the most respected scholars in South Korea. Nothing about that made sense. Avery lowered her eyes. For years, she had carefully avoided conversations about her past. The fewer questions people asked, the easier life became. But Professor Min was not someone who accepted easy answers. He stepped closer and spoke again. Yonsei University, he said quietly. Department of International Communications. You sat in the front row. Avery felt her stomach tighten. The room disappeared for a moment. The chandeliers, the executives, the polished silverware, all of it faded behind a memory she had spent years trying to forget. A large lecture hall in Seoul. Bright mornings. Stacks of textbooks. Endless dreams about the future. She remembered it all. More importantly, she remembered him. Professor Min had been one of the few people who believed she could accomplish something extraordinary. Back then, she had been known for her academic achievements. Her professors predicted a remarkable career. Recruiters had pursued her before graduation. Opportunities had seemed limitless. Yet life had not followed the path she imagined. Avery Brooks, Professor Min said softly. Top of your class. A stunned silence swept across the room. One executive nearly dropped his wine glass. The head server near the doorway stared in disbelief. This was not the story they expected from a waitress. Damien leaned back slightly, studying her with renewed interest. Avery wished the floor would open beneath her. She had worked very hard to become invisible. Years of effort were unraveling in a matter of minutes. That cannot be possible, someone murmured from the far end of the table. Professor Min turned toward the speaker. It is possible, he said firmly. I remember excellence when I see it. Avery looked away. The compliment hurt more than criticism. Excellence belonged to a different version of herself. A version that no longer existed. Or at least that was what she had convinced herself for years. Professor Min seemed ready to ask another question, but Damien finally spoke. His voice was measured, calm, and impossible to ignore. Miss Brooks, he said, I believe everyone in this room would like to know how a woman with that background ended up serving tables in my restaurant. The room went silent again. Avery closed her eyes for a brief second. The question she had spent years avoiding had finally arrived. Avery did not answer immediately. The question hung over the room like a weight nobody could ignore. Beyond the glass walls, Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky, thousands of lights stretching toward the horizon. Inside, however, nobody seemed interested in the view anymore. Every ounce of attention remained fixed on her. Avery slowly placed the serving tray onto a nearby table. The polished silver surface reflected the chandeliers above, distorted and trembling slightly, much like the thoughts running through her mind. She had spent years avoiding this moment. Years building a life where nobody asked difficult questions. Years convincing herself that the person Professor Min remembered no longer existed. Yet standing there now, surrounded by strangers who suddenly wanted answers, she realized how exhausting that lie had become. Life happened, she finally said. Her voice was soft, but in the silence it carried clearly across the room. A few executives exchanged puzzled looks. The answer seemed too simple for a story that clearly was not. Professor Min continued watching her with patient eyes. He understood there was more. Damien understood it too. Avery drew a slow breath. My mother became ill during my final year in Seoul, she explained. The treatments were expensive. My family needed help. I thought I could manage both school and everything happening back home. She paused. I was wrong. Nobody interrupted. Even the restaurant staff near the doorway remained perfectly still. I came back to the United States temporarily, she continued. At least that was the plan. A few weeks turned into a few months. Then a year. Bills kept arriving. Responsibilities kept growing. Opportunities disappeared one at a time. The room remained silent. Not the uncomfortable silence from earlier, but the kind that appears when people begin listening with their hearts instead of their assumptions. Professor Min lowered his gaze. The sadness on his face suggested he already understood the rest. You never returned, he said quietly in Korean. Avery shook her head. No, sir. The professor nodded slowly. His expression carried disappointment, though not in her. It was disappointment in circumstances, in wasted potential, in how easily life could redirect even the brightest future. One executive near the end of the table suddenly spoke. You mean to tell me that you walked away from a top academic career because you needed to support your family? Avery looked toward him. I did not walk away, she answered gently. I held on as long as I could. Eventually, there was nothing left to hold. The words settled heavily across the room. Damien leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. For the first time that evening, he was no longer looking at a waitress. He was looking at someone who had sacrificed opportunities most people would never receive. Someone who had quietly carried disappointment without asking anyone for sympathy. Then Professor Min surprised everyone. He reached inside his jacket and removed a worn leather card holder. From it, he carefully unfolded a yellowed newspaper clipping. The edges were faded from age. The paper had clearly been carried for years. He placed it gently on the table. Several people leaned forward. At the center of the article was a photograph of a much younger Avery standing beside a university podium, smiling as she accepted an academic award. The headline beneath the image described one of the most promising international communications students in South Korea. The room fell completely silent. Nobody knew what to say, and for the first time all evening, Avery looked genuinely shocked. For several seconds, Avery could not take her eyes off the newspaper clipping. The photograph seemed to belong to someone else. The young woman smiling from the page looked confident, certain of where life was heading. She remembered that day with painful clarity. The auditorium in Seoul had been packed. Faculty members had applauded. Recruiters had approached her afterward with business cards and opportunities. People had spoken about her future as though success were already guaranteed. Yet standing in the Han River Club years later, wearing a black server uniform and comfortable work shoes, that future felt impossibly distant. Professor Min carefully touched the corner of the article. I kept this because your story inspired many students, he said quietly. You arrived in Korea knowing almost nobody. You mastered the language. You earned scholarships. You worked harder than anyone in your class. Avery swallowed hard. Compliments felt uncomfortable, especially these. They reminded her of everything she had lost. I did not finish the journey, she said softly. The professor immediately shook his head. You are mistaken. His voice carried the calm certainty of a teacher correcting an important lesson. A journey does not lose value simply because the destination changes. The words settled over the room. Several executives lowered their eyes. Earlier that evening, many of them had barely acknowledged Avery's existence. Some had handed her menus without looking up. Others had spoken around her as though she were furniture. Now they listened to every word. Damien remained silent, but his expression had changed. The cold distance that usually separated him from everyone else seemed less pronounced. He looked at the newspaper clipping, then at Avery, as though trying to reconcile two entirely different realities. The waitress standing before him and the celebrated student in the photograph appeared to be different people. Yet both were undeniably the same woman. Do you know what happened after she left? Professor Min suddenly asked the room. Nobody answered. The elderly scholar smiled faintly. Neither did I. He looked directly at Avery. I searched for your name several times over the years. Former students told me you disappeared. One professor believed you had joined an international organization. Another thought you had become a diplomat. Nobody imagined you were here. Avery felt heat rise to her cheeks. The attention was overwhelming. She wished they would return to discussing business. Yet part of her felt something else. Something unfamiliar. For years she had carried her sacrifices alone. Nobody had seen them. Nobody had understood them. Tonight, for the first time, someone did. Professor Min folded the clipping and returned it to his card holder. Then he smiled warmly. I am disappointed about only one thing, he said. Avery looked up. What is that, sir? The old professor's eyes sparkled beneath the chandelier light. That the world convinced you that serving others erased your accomplishments. The room fell silent once again. Avery could not respond. Because deep down, she realized there had been many nights when she believed exactly that. Avery lowered her gaze, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Professor Min's words had reached a place she had spent years protecting. She remembered the long shifts, the overdue notices, the nights spent calculating which bill could wait another week. She remembered telling herself that survival mattered more than dreams. Over time, that belief had become so familiar that she stopped questioning it. Around the table, nobody spoke. The executives who had arrived expecting a routine business dinner now sat quietly, confronted by a story they had never anticipated. Damien Vaughn observed everything. Throughout his career, he had learned to evaluate people quickly. In his world, first impressions often became permanent judgments. Yet tonight, every assumption he had made about Avery Brooks had been dismantled piece by piece. He looked at the woman standing beside the service table. Her uniform was simple. Her posture remained humble. Nothing about her appearance suggested extraordinary talent. Yet she had corrected an international misunderstanding, spoken flawless Korean, earned the respect of one of the most distinguished scholars in Seoul, and carried years of sacrifice without ever mentioning it. Damien found himself wondering how many other people he had overlooked. The thought unsettled him. One executive finally cleared his throat. Why did you never tell anyone? He asked. Avery gave a small smile. Because nobody asked. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The truth was impossible to ignore. Most of them had never spoken to her beyond requesting coffee or another glass of water. They had seen a uniform and decided they already knew the entire story. Professor Min nodded slowly. That is often the problem, he said. People mistake visibility for value. Damien glanced around the room. For the first time all evening, several executives seemed embarrassed. The head server near the doorway looked particularly shaken. He had supervised Avery for more than a year, yet he knew almost nothing about her. The realization hung heavily in the air. Then Professor Min turned toward Damien. Mr. Vaughn, he said warmly, you invited me here tonight to discuss partnerships and future opportunities. Before we continue, I would like to make a request. Damien nodded. Of course. The elderly professor smiled. I would like Miss Brooks to remain at the table. The room fell silent once more. Avery's eyes widened. She immediately shook her head. Sir, I cannot. I am working. You are, Professor Min agreed. And you have already done the most important work of the evening. A faint smile appeared on several faces around the room. Avery felt her cheeks warm. She was not accustomed to praise, especially in front of powerful strangers. Damien remained thoughtful for a moment. Then he stood from his chair. Every conversation stopped immediately. His reputation alone commanded attention. He looked at Avery and spoke calmly. Miss Brooks, please take a seat. Avery stared at him, convinced she had misunderstood. But Damien's expression never changed. For the first time since she entered the room that evening, she realized nobody was looking at her as a waitress anymore. And that frightened her almost as much as being invisible once had. For a moment, nobody moved. Avery stood frozen beside the table, uncertain whether she had heard Damien correctly. The invitation felt unreal. Just hours earlier, she had been preparing coffee, clearing plates, and making herself as invisible as possible. Now one of the most powerful men in the room was asking her to sit among executives, investors, and distinguished guests. The contrast was almost impossible to process. Sir, I do not think that is appropriate, Avery said quietly. Damien's expression remained calm. I was not asking whether it was appropriate, he replied. I was asking you to take a seat. A few guests smiled at the response. Not because it was harsh, but because it carried an unusual sincerity. Damien was not offering charity. He was offering respect. There was a difference, and everyone in the room could feel it. Slowly, Avery pulled out an empty chair near the end of the table and sat down. The movement seemed simple, yet it changed the atmosphere completely. The same people who had overlooked her all evening now adjusted their posture when speaking. Several executives introduced themselves. One apologized for not recognizing her earlier. Another admitted that he had assumed she was simply part of the service staff with no connection to the discussion. Avery accepted each comment politely. She carried no anger, no bitterness, only quiet exhaustion from years of being underestimated. Professor Min watched the interactions with satisfaction. Then he asked a question that made several people uncomfortable. How many extraordinary individuals have you ignored because of a uniform? Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became the answer. One executive looked down at his folded hands. Another stared into his untouched coffee. The interpreter who had created the misunderstanding earlier appeared particularly embarrassed. Yet Professor Min was not trying to humiliate anyone. His tone remained gentle. The mistake tonight was not a language mistake, he said. The real mistake was assuming wisdom only sits at certain tables. The room became still. Damien slowly nodded. Those words struck him more deeply than he expected. Throughout his career, he had built businesses by identifying opportunities others missed. Yet somehow he had failed to notice the remarkable woman working inside his own establishment. The realization bothered him. Across from him, Avery sat quietly. She did not appear triumphant. She did not seek recognition. In fact, she seemed slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. That humility only increased the respect people felt toward her. Then something unexpected happened. The head server stepped forward from the doorway. He cleared his throat and looked directly at Avery. I owe you an apology, he said. I supervised you for 18 months and never once asked about your story. Avery looked surprised. The man offered a small, sincere smile. That was my failure, not yours. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. The apology carried weight because it was genuine. One by one, others began reflecting on their own assumptions. Not because they were forced to, but because the truth had become impossible to ignore. The room that had begun the evening with status, titles, and appearances now revolved around something far more important: human dignity. And as the city lights shimmered beyond the windows, Avery realized something she had not felt in years. She was no longer invisible. The remainder of the evening unfolded differently than anyone had expected. Conversations that had once revolved around contracts, projections, and negotiations slowly shifted toward stories, ideas, and shared experiences. Professor Min spoke about former students who had overcome impossible obstacles. Executives discussed the mentors who had changed their lives. Even the atmosphere itself seemed lighter, as though an invisible wall had finally been removed from the room. Avery listened more than she spoke. Old habits were difficult to break. Yet each time someone asked her a question, they waited for her answer with genuine interest. Not because of her job title, not because of her past achievements, but because they finally saw her as a person. Hours later, as coffee cups emptied and the city lights deepened into midnight, the meeting came to an end. Chairs slid quietly across polished floors. Handshakes were exchanged. Business cards changed hands. The guests began gathering their coats. Professor Min approached Avery one last time. His eyes carried the same kindness she remembered from years ago. I hope this is not the last time our paths cross, he said in Korean. Avery smiled. I hope not either. The professor nodded and handed her a small card. If you ever decide that your story is not finished, call me. Then he walked away. Avery stared at the card for several moments before carefully placing it in her pocket. It felt strangely heavy, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Possibility. As the final guests departed, Damien remained near the windows overlooking Manhattan. The skyline stretched endlessly before him. He waited until the room had nearly emptied before speaking. Miss Brooks. Avery turned. Yes, sir. Damien held out a business card. Simple, elegant, unremarkable except for the name printed across the front. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, he said. Avery blinked. For what? A faint smile appeared on his face. It was small, but genuine. An interview. Avery looked confused. I already work here. Not for the position I have in mind. The words hung in the air between them. Damien glanced toward the conference table where she had corrected an international misunderstanding, earned the respect of a renowned scholar, and changed the entire tone of an evening. I spent years believing I was good at recognizing talent, he said quietly. Tonight proved otherwise. Avery looked down at the card in her hand. For years, opportunities had seemed like doors permanently closed. Now one stood open in front of her, and she did not know what to feel. Gratitude, fear, hope, perhaps all three. Outside, the city continued moving beneath a sea of lights. Taxis crossed intersections. Office windows glowed against the darkness. Millions of people chased their own uncertain futures. Avery stepped toward the elevator and paused before the doors closed. She looked back once more at the dining room where everything had changed. Earlier that evening, she had entered believing she was invisible. She left carrying something she thought she had lost long ago. Not a business card, not a job opportunity, something far more valuable. The certainty that her sacrifices had mattered. The certainty that her worth had never disappeared simply because others failed to see it. And as the elevator doors closed and carried her toward the street below, the room remained silent behind her. Not because anyone had run out of words, but because everyone there had been reminded of something easy to forget. Human dignity does not depend on a title, a salary, or a seat at the table. And that night, they remembered exactly what dignity looks like.